Hi.
Thank you all for joining us today for the joint presentation of New Mexico Japanese American Citizens League and Historic Santa Fe Foundation. I'm Melanie Mcquarte. I'm the development coordinator here at Historic Santa Fe Foundation, and I'm joining you in the offices located on Canyon Road, 545 Canyon Road in Santa Fe, New Mexico. This is one of our monthly salon series with Victor on Confinement in the Land of Enchantment, Japanese American and Japanese internment camps in New Mexico. We want to welcome you to the salon series. We do these on a monthly basis. They are free for members. We're a member-based organization. They're free for members, and there's a drop-in rate, which we're happy to welcome many of you for a first time visiting us with Historic Santa Fe Foundation. We have an upcoming talk on April 29th at 3 p.m. with Richard Miller on his book on John Slough with the University of New Mexico Press. It's on Slough and the Colorado volunteers who came down to defend New Mexico against the Confederacy during the American Civil War. And then on, I hope to have another one in May too. We're working on that for Preservation Month, so stay tuned for that. And we also have one on June 17th with Bobby Green. It's a talk on Juneteenth, so we hope you'll join us for that one. On Friday, May 7th, we're going to have an opening here, a limited opening, masks required, for Elizabeth Hahn's paintings. So if you want to find out more about all of these events, you can find them on historicsantafe.org. Many of them are under our events tab. Our membership information is also found there too. For today's talk, the participants joined us without audio or video. We usually take questions for these events through the chat box. So if you'd like to present a question that I'll read out to Victor after the talk, you're welcome to type it into the chat. If you want to do it during the course of the talk, you're welcome to do that as well. I'll try to get to as many questions as I can. We usually try and keep it for about an hour for the talk. So we have Victor Yamada here with us today. Victor has a degree in engineering from the University of Washington and business administration from Pepperdine University. He has worked as a strategic environmental policy manager for 40 years. He's also volunteered for the New Mexico Japanese American Citizen League, Japan America Society of New Mexico, and Asian American Association of New Mexico. He led many key project activities in the New Mexico Japanese American Citizen League, including preparation for the Confinement in the Land of Enchantment traveling exhibition and community forums for Santa Fe, Lordsburg, Fort Stanton, Clovis, and Old Raton Ranch, the Baca Camp. He prepared oral histories of local Japanese Americans as part of the Asian American Legacy Stories Project, and directed Japanese to English translation project, including Lordsburg, Santa Fe Prisoner Letters, and Santa Fe Prisoner Scrapbook. Today, he will discuss Confinement in the Land of Enchantment. So thank you so much for joining us today, Victor. We're really excited for this presentation.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I really wish that I could be there in person, but again, with the pandemic, we have to do the best we can with this discussion on Zoom, as have been shown struggling with it, but I think we'll get through it okay. This image that you see is a painting done by Jerry West, local artist that probably most of you know who he is. We use this image quite a bit in our CLOE project, so that's why I've got it there. Again, the title of the discussion is Confinement in the Land of Enchantment, Japanese Americans in New Mexico during World War II. And we use the acronym CLOE to shorten our reference there whenever you see that, that's what that stands for. I, with the New Mexico JACL, have been a participant in this project for many years. Actually, the project's been going on for about 10 years of activity, so it's involved quite a bit of effort. The project team has involved Colorado State University, Central New Mexico Community College, ourselves, New Mexico JACL, many other organizations and institutions, and many volunteers. Much of the work has been funded by National Park Service, actually a number of National Park Service grants over the years. So we really appreciate their help in that respect. For this discussion today, I'm going to be drawing from the CLOE project and the multiple phases that we've been going through. The phase 1, phase 2 scope has generally involved putting together the historical background or historical context, research on the camp histories, installing of historic markers, and developing the project website. First, I do want to touch on a bit of background. I think most of you in the audience have heard about the national incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, but I do want to still provide a bit of the background to put the rest of the discussion in context. We had December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor bombing. President Roosevelt, in February of 1942, signed Executive Order 9066 that authorized the War Department to, quote, prescribe military areas from which any and all persons may be excluded. This led to the setup of the national incarceration camps, the building of the camps, and the operation by the War Relocation Authority. And those are the camps that generally imprisoned 120,000 Japanese Americans during the war. This setting up of the WRA camps basically moved Japanese Americans from the exclusion area that's shown on this map to 10 major camps. As you can see on the map, hopefully that it drew a line down the middle of Washington, Oregon, included all of California, and a portion of Arizona. And those that were picked up in these areas were moved to one of the 10 camps, Tule Lake or Manzanar in California, Poston or Gila River in Arizona, Topaz, Utah, Minidoka, Idaho, Heart Mountain, Wyoming, Grenada, Colorado, or Roar or Jerome in Arkansas. You see also the government also operated a number of other ancillary camps that are listed here. And then you'll see that there are some listed in New Mexico, which is what we'll be talking about through the rest of the presentation. The government had an organizational setup to run these various camps. I'll just highlight a few to repeat. The War Relocation Authority ran the WRA camps. The Department of Justice, Immigration and Naturalization Service ran Baca Camp, Santa Fe, and Fort Stanton. The War Department, which involved the U.S. Army, ran Lordsburg. Now I'll focus on the New Mexico camps that some of you may know less about, so we will get into a more detailed discussion. Again, these 4 camps held approximately 6,000 Japanese Americans during the war. And these prisoners were picked up and moved to these sites from a number of locations, ranging from Alaska, Oregon, Washington, California, Hawaii, and other states, and also included a few from Latin America. These just show the sites on a map, and I'll go through these 4 sites in a chronological order in terms of when they were built and operated throughout the war. So I'm going to go through Baca Camp, which has also been known as Old Raton Ranch, Lordsburg, Santa Fe, and Fort Stanton. Baca Camp and Fort Stanton, as you might know, are both in Lincoln County. First, Baca Camp, which held Clovis, New Mexico residents. Beginning from 1910, the Santa Fe Railroad hired Japanese immigrants to work in their facilities in Clovis. And in 1941, that totaled Japanese American residents in Clovis of 32. 15 of those were adults working for the railroad, and 17 of those were children who were born in the U.S. in Clovis. In January of 1942, all of those 32 were picked up, taken into custody, and transported in government cars in the dead of night. They arrived at Fort Stanton, and the decision was made sort of on the spot that they would not stay there, and they were moved to the abandoned CCC site that's called Baca Camp. The camp itself was about 14 acres with 9 buildings. There was no government money spent on the camp repairs to be able to hold these residents. The people themselves really had to do some of the repairs to make it livable for the time that they spent there. They were there for about a year and then moved generally to the WRE camps, Arizona and Utah primarily. This is a photo showing a military parade in Clovis during the wartime. This is a map to illustrate where Clovis is relative to the Old Raton Ranch, Baca Camp that the residents were moved to. This is a big group photo of railroad workers in Clovis in the 1920s. This is a drawing by one of the Japanese American residents that shows the Japanese segregation camp that they lived in Clovis. Right. It actually was on railroad property. This is a photo to give you a feel of the CCC camp in the 1930s. This is one of the prisoners' drawings of the barracks quarters. Another drawing by a prisoner with a broader view of the Baca Camp. This is a photo of the campsite more in current times. It's managed at this point by the U.S. Forest Service. The land is managed by the U.S. Forest Service and state parks. There, unfortunately, aren't very many structures that are left at the particular site that reflect the camp used as a confinement site. There's one small building that was apparently the home of the camp administrator and then there's a few concrete foundations, but that's all that we've seen there that go back to the camp's use. On the access road to the campsite from the main highway there is the location of one of our historic markers. A good note to take reference to, in 2014, the city of Clovis actually provided a formal apology to the Japanese American residents who were affected by the pickup action during World War II. And they also selected 3 representatives from that community to serve as grand marshals for the 2014 Pioneer Days Parade. And this is a photo showing the 3. The fellow in the green shirt, Roy Ibahara, is waving there. To his left, Lily Kimura was also a child during the pickup time frame. And unfortunately, to her left, you can only see his hat, is her brother, Fred Kimura. Okay, moving on to Lordsburg. The plans were developed and the construction began in January of 1942. I should probably stop here and mention for these men that were picked up for Lordsburg and Santa Fe, they were picked up starting December 7th, 1941 in the various locations that I showed to you in a lot of the coastal areas. So it was fast moving, and that's why the plans were drawn and the construction began in January of 1942. The camp for Japanese Americans, for the use for the Japanese Americans, ran from January of 1942 to November of 1943, operated by the INS U.S. Army. The camp itself was situated about 6 miles east of town, a very large complex, over 2,100 acres with 283 buildings. And of the Japanese Americans, there were over 1,500 detained there, as I note there, from Alaska, Hawaii, and a number of the West Coast states. One of the incidents of note in July of 1942, a guard killed 2 prisoners. And the allegation was that the prisoners were trying to escape. Evidence seems not to support that, but the guard was not. The guard was found not guilty. The campsite itself, when the war ended, the property and the facility itself was sold off by the government. So there's very few remaining structures. There's a few buildings, there's some ground structures, and some underground facilities, but very limited because, again, it's in the property, was turned over to private property. This photo provides a little bit of the feel for the landscape in that at that site. This is a prisoner's drawing of the camp. After the Japanese Americans were moved in the latter part of 1943 from this site continued to be used by the government and held prisoners of war from Germany and Italy till the end of the war. This is a camp plan, and obviously one of the things I note here, and you saw this in the previous image, the guard towers. All of those GTs on the map are guard towers that were used at the camp. So definitely was a prison site.
Victor?
Yes.
Your sound is kind of cutting out a little bit here and there. So I don't know if you can turn it up a little bit or maybe speak louder. I'm not sure because I think your microphone is kind of cutting out in and out a little bit. So
Okay.
like we missed some important things like the guard tower one in the last one. So but yeah, just try and do your best maybe to speak a little louder because they're like about once every couple minutes it kind of cuts out a little.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It may be partially my mumbling, but I'll try to speak louder and be closer to the mic.
Yeah, just to make sure. So if we can get it a little bit clearer, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. No, I appreciate that because yeah, that's the only way I can have the feedback to know whether certain things are working or not. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions afterwards if there's gaps
Yeah.
and things that people miss.
Yeah, that's one of the things I will note is that I'm going relatively fast, so over a lot of material. So I appreciate that. That's sometimes difficult to pick everything up.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
I'm trying to provide major points and obviously hit some of the interest points of the participants. This is a photo of a group of the prisoners at Lordsburg, and this one actually is a group from Alaska. And you'll note, as it'll show in some other photos, that the great bulk of the prisoners picked up were older men. And so this photo reflects that. You can see that they're up a little bit in years, and it's all men. Again, one of the prisoners made this drawing of the interior of one of the barracks. That gives you a feel for the setup and the conditions. This is a photo of a sculpture that was put together in the ground of the U.S. Eagle, and this is symbolic of the patriotic feeling of the prisoners to the U.S. government, even though they were in a prison camp. As I said before, this is on private property, so it's unfortunately deteriorating in quality as we speak. The prisoners did publish their own newspaper in Japanese, and many of the prisoners in Japanese wrote back to their families, outside of the camp. And this is one of those that was written by Mr. Hanazawa back to his family in Hawaii. Both the pages of the newspaper and these letters in Japanese, some of our volunteers from the New Mexico JCL translated these into English. Both the letters and the translations reside now or held in the collection at the New Mexico History Museum, the Chavez Library. This is a photo of the location where the prisoners were shot along the side of the road. This is an example of some of the few remaining buildings at the site. This was used initially as the hospital, and now it's been converted to a residence. The historic markers associated with the Lordsburg site, our project did develop those and provide those to the site area. There's a couple that are at the City Hall, and there's one at the Lordsburg Hidalgo County Museum. and also one near the entrance to the site grounds. Okay, let's go on to Santa Fe. And I know a lot of you are interested most specifically in the Santa Fe camp. And you probably know some of this material that I'm presenting here. In February of 1942, the INS acquired about 80 acres from the New Mexico Penitentiary, which was an abandoned CCC site that was built in 1933. And the location was about 1.5 miles from the center of Santa Fe. It took about 2 months to convert to house the planned 1,400 prisoners. And they started arriving in March. And it was deactivated for a time in late 1942, but then reactivated in February 1943 and expanded to hold a larger capacity of about 2,000. The overall camp operated to hold Japanese Americans up until April of 1946, and over 4,500 prisoners were totaled in that confinement. And as I think I touched on before, the prisoners were drawn from places like Alaska, Hawaii, and a number of the western coastal states. A little bit later, I will show you a map of the then and now of the campsite. I mentioned here Dr. Ben Tanaka. He was one of those picked up on December 7th, 1941 in Portland. He was a practicing medical doctor, but he got caught up in the pickup. And eventually he ended up at the Santa Fe camp. And during his time at the camp, he was the only person there with medical training. So he served as the de facto medical officer for the camp during the time that he was there. One of the intriguing remnants that he provided, he had kept or maintained a scrap album that his family donated to the New Mexico History Museum that includes a number of very interesting pages, and I'll show you some of those. And again, that album, the original album, is in the collection of the Chavez Library. Again, this is Jerry West's painting. His father was a guard at the camp, so he heard stories from his father, and that partially inspired him to do this particular image. The piece of art is in the collection of the New Mexico Museum of Art. As I touched on before, have used this image a number of times. We actually have it as the cover of our outreach publication, certainly with the permission of Jerry West. There's a drawing of the camp by one of the prisoners. There's a photo of a group, and again, this group is from Oregon, mostly from the Portland area. And again, you see most are older in age. You see the building and you see the hills in the background. This is a photo of the gentleman there was imprisoned at the Santa Fe camp. This is a photo of his family as they were living in Lima, Peru. This is a painting by another prisoner, watercolor. To me, it's quite poignant because it's very well done. But again, it's the view from inside the camp looking up to the hills surrounding Santa Fe. The previous slide, that painting it's poetry, it's calligraphy, woodwork, are some of the examples, and this particular one of work done by the prisoners. This is stone and wood sculptures done with pieces picked up, raw pieces picked up at the campsite or in surrounding areas to the camp. This provides an overview of the campsite. The version on the left is 1951 time period, and the version on the right is about 2015. The one on the left shows the camp buildings in the center there, center of the image. The general what am I trying to say? The general locale, you can probably orient yourself on the right picture. On the very right is Highway 84, 285 heading north. And at the very bottom is Alameda. I think as probably a number of you know, the government sold off the property, and eventually Casa Solana development took its place, and that's what's shown in the 2015 image. So there's no remaining structures that people are aware of. The anecdotes are that maybe some of the trees that are in the development may have been growing during the war years and were still retained for the residential development. As a number of you know, there was a Santa Fe internment camp historic marker installed at the Frank Ortiz Dog Park. On the right image to the upper left, you can see the dog park, and so the marker is up in that area overlooking the old campsite. On to the fourth, the Fort Stanton site. And let's see, Melanie, I don't have a watch with me. What's the time? Where am I in my timeline?
We're still okay. We're at quarter till, you know.
Quarter till?
Till.
Yeah, okay.
But
Okay.
then we had a delay because because our technical difficulties. So you still have a little bit of time. And then we'll
okay,
still
I just want to know generally, and then yeah, I can go through Fort Stanton, and then we can be ready for the Q&A session. So the Fort Stanton, as many of you know, is a long time historic site. It was built in 1855. It's been used for many different purposes. The Japanese American confinement activity was in 1945. They involved less than 20 prisoners who initially were held at Tule Lake in California, then they were moved to Santa Fe, and then they were moved to a segregation facility at Fort Stanton in early 1945. These prisoners were generally known as agitators. They were pro-Japan, so they were protesting that they felt allegiance to Japan, and demonstrated that through the various places that they were at. After the war, they were given the opportunity to be sent back to Japan, and many of them did, taking the route provided by the U.S. government through Terminal Island and back to Japan. or to Japan. This is a photo to give you a feeling of the present Fort Stanton. This is some of the buildings that were for the officers. The next two are overviews of the historic site. This one to the right is looking north, and if you look at the to the very right lower corner, Rio Bonita River is there, and if you keep going to the right to the very edge of the image is where the Japanese segregation camp was. This is illustrative of the types of housing that those prisoners lived through. These victory huts were used at other ones of the camps. We don't have photos exactly from Fort Stanton, but these were exactly the type of huts that the prisoners were living in for those at Fort Stanton. Unfortunately, like with most of the other sites, the facilities that were used for the Japanese segregation camp were all knocked down, so down to the bare ground. So this is a view of the site pretty much at the present time. We have put a historic marker at that location to at least provide some documentation to its previous use. I have this particular slide to use as a reminder that except for the Clovis residents, all of those prisoners that were held in the sites in New Mexico were from outside of New Mexico, as I touched on before, from the western coastal states, Alaska, Hawaii, and so there were a few Japanese Americans living in New Mexico during that time frame. Starting in the 1880s and 1890s, there were some people working as coal miners, farm workers, railroad workers. In the 1900 to the 1950 time frame, that totaled about a few hundred. There was mixed treatment of them in New Mexico. As you've heard from Clovis, that was severe treatment to positive treatment in the city of Gallup. And I don't have the time now, but you probably know some of the positive stories about Hershey Miramura, Congressional Medal of Honor winner, Roy Nakayama, Las Cruces area, who was Mr. Chile, coming up with research at New Mexico State University for new breeds of our chili for the state. Most of you know about the development and the installation of the Santa Fe internment camp marker that's now sits at the Ortiz Dog Park. In our CLOE phase 2 and phase 3, again, partially this is a repeat, but in our phase 2 and phase 3, we did install historic markers at Baca Camp, Fort Stanton, and Lordsburg. We did put together and distribute an outreach publication that's 110 pages. They were distributed free to all of the school libraries in the state, as well as to historical organizations and museums. We put together a project website, which is available online. That's noted in Melanie's announcement on this particular talk. So you can, if you haven't, you can access that online. And then we continued on to put together a traveling exhibit based on the research materials that we had, and held community presentations. These were at the Lordsburg Hidalgo County Museum, at the Santa Fe Public Library, Southside Branch, and at the Fort Stanton Historical Site. At Fort Stanton, we also had a tour of the Baca Camp location for those that were interested. And we have put together a film documentary that's also available online. And again, Melanie has posted the link to that, I believe, on your website. The outreach publication, which I can show you, but we do have copies of that, so that is available for the public to purchase if you're interested in. So that can be talked about if you're interested in terms of getting some of that product. Two things that I'll finish with in terms of future events. One is, and again, this has been shared with you, Dr. Gail Ogawa has published a book titled Remembering Our Grandfather's Exile. Her grandfather in Hawaii was one of those picked up and eventually held in the Santa Fe. Once she was learning of this story, she really wanted to dig into that, and she also wanted to find the stories of many others in Hawaii of a similar nature as her grandfather, to see what they went through during the war, their exile to Santa Fe and other camp locations, and then their return to, most of them back to Hawaii. This book's been published and it's available. Gail is potentially going to be able to give an in-person talk in Santa Fe in November. She's still working on the details, but we'll keep you posted in terms of that potentially being an opportunity for those of you who live locally. I personally have this copy. I've read it and I'm really impressed with the detail that's gone into it, and also, again, showing the individual stories of what these prisoners had to go through this time period in World War II. One of the poignant aspects that she touches on is that while the grandfathers, the elders in the family, elderly men in the family were in these camps, their sons had volunteered for the U.S. Army and for the 442 unit, and were fighting for the U.S. on the front lines, but they were not permitted to visit their fathers who were imprisoned by the same government in these camps. Later on in the war, they were allowed to, but in the early years, they were prevented from visiting because of the restrictions on the prisoners in the camps. The other future event is Gail and others are leading this effort. They have planned a 20th anniversary event and pilgrimage around the Santa Fe internment camp and the historic marker. And it's, you see on the flyer there that it's basically almost exactly a year from now, April 23rd, 2022. It will involve programs held at the History Museum, New Mexico History Museum, probably in the auditorium, and then there'll be a pilgrimage up to the historic marker, and more details will come out. This is all being led by Gail. She's working with the staff at the History Museum to plan this out, and as well as obviously a lot of other parties. But that's, for those of you who are interested, that's something to put on your calendar. I think in a rush, that's pretty much what I've prepared to talk about. Again, the New Mexico JCL is a local nonprofit that we've been in place since the 1950s locally to help protect and promote the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and all other groups inside and outside of New Mexico. The national organization has about 10,000 members with 100 chapters with obviously that broad mission. And the national organization especially is quite active now with the unfortunate current anti-Asian sentiment that's in existence now in the country. So with that, I'll turn it back to Melanie, and she can coordinate the Q&A. Thank you very much for your
Thank you, Victor. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we can, I'm happy to put your email as well on that our web page too.
Yes.
Can people sign up for the New Mexico Japanese American Citizen League for the notifications of upcoming events if they go to the
Yes.
website? Okay, so I can make sure that website's there, and then maybe I'll put your email on our site too if anybody wants to do any kind of follow-up with you. And then those last two slides that you showed, I just want to emphasize again of Gail's book and then the upcoming events for April 2022. Those flyers you both share with me, and I put those on our site too. So if anybody wants those, or if anyone needs for me to act as an intermediary, just Melanie at historicsantafé.org, or you can find it on our website too. So I'm happy to share emails for people too if they want to send them to you. So we do have a few questions, Victor. The first one that popped up here, a question about POW delineation. Had the men looking at the Alaska men at Lordsburg actually been charged with crimes or war crimes, or were they just of Japanese descent?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let me see if I can give a concise answer. None of these men were charged with any crimes. They were classified by the government. They were aliens. They were legal aliens of the U.S. All of these were Japanese who had immigrated to the U.S. and generally been living in the U.S. for many, many years before World War II. And as I said, they were legal aliens. The government, at the beginning of the war, they defined these individuals as enemy aliens with the potential security risk to the US government. And that was the sort of the justification why they were put on a list with the FBI and picked up and eventually ending up in the Department of Justice or the Army confinement sites, such as the ones in New Mexico. So again, to repeat, they were never charged with a crime, and they were definitely not considered as prisoners of war, because to be a prisoner of war, you have to be basically a military person from one of the enemies to the US.
Yeah, so I have another question, well, a few more questions. What was New Mexicans' response to having internment camps in the state? Were there groups of New Mexicans speaking out against them?
I can't really speak toward that. I can probably share some anecdotes, and actually probably some of your members might be some of those who could speak toward this. I'll give a quick response in two respects. The few Japanese Americans who were living in New Mexico certainly knew about that, and they probably had relatives, and I've heard anecdotally that they maybe visited some of those relatives because they may have come, the residents in New Mexico may have come from California. So through their relative connection, they knew that so-and-so may be in the Santa Fe camp or the Lordsburg camp, and they may have attempted to visit them, but that was the extent of their limited contact. And again, as I said before, no Japanese Americans living in New Mexico, except for the Clovis residents, were picked up and put into any of the camps, Santa Fe or Lordsburg or Fort Stanton. The other quick response to the question is that obviously Santa Fe residents knew of the existence of the camp, may have been limited because obviously it was a secure facility, but they had to have their reactions to, why the camp was there, who was being held there, and so on and so forth. In our community forum that we held in Santa Fe in 2018, we did have residents who remember the camp, and some of them shared their memories of what they knew and what they thought of the camp, and it was across the board. They didn't know much because obviously it was secure, but they also felt sorry. Later on, as the camp security became looser, they interacted with some of the prisoners. So we actually are, some of our researchers are actually trying to collect some of those interactions so that we can add that to the broader Santa Fe internment camp experience to the longtime Santa Fe residents.
Okay, we could help see if we could collect stories too. If anybody's, we'll be happy to put that in our newsletter too. Someone actually had posted here as a comment, Mary Ortiz said she wanted to emphasize the value of the historic markers. She says, I grew up in Santa Fe and the existence of these camps was never mentioned to me. I only became aware of them because of the marker at Rosario Cemetery. So there's one person who's attending who grew up who actually wasn't aware of them at all. So,
my additional comment, and I appreciate that it's obviously a shame that a number of the physical structures were torn down, so there's very little physical remnants that can be pointed to. I know your foundation is focused on a lot of that, and it's unfortunate that in these camps, very little of that opportunity happened. And at the least, we are able to provide these written documentation and some of the historic markers so that they do locate the spots, and they do at least provide some discussion so that anybody who sees the markers will have some of the story and hopefully lead them to additional of our materials so that they can hear or see more of the complete story. But that's part of our major aim, was to record the history and make it accessible, both actually to Japanese Americans, because a lot of the Japanese American families have not heard much of their relatives, their grandfathers, etc., and their life in these camps. And so they had the same deep curiosity, as well as those outside the camp who had heard about it but didn't know much about what happened, who was in these camps, and so forth. So we've been gratified that both those types of audiences have appreciated our work and have inquired and accessed our material that we've provided.
So we have a few more questions. I'm going to have to cut off questions now because I think we're going to run out of time. But once attendee asked what delineated the New Mexico and the camps in other states, the 10 highlighted at the beginning of the talk. What was the size and nature of the prisoners for some other reason? I mean, it's a very broad question, but I don't know if you can maybe narrow it by discussing who was at the New Mexico camps a little bit more beyond what you presented.
So I think the question is, why were they located in New Mexico? I think in general, and that question's come up a few times. Again, my first response is, that was certainly determined by the U.S. government officials who were running this program. But I think we can speculate that one is the desire was certainly, generally speaking, to have these camps away from the coast, because that was the perceived threat was from, those that were closer to Japan and so forth. The other was to put them in isolated areas, again, from a security standpoint. And another practical aspect was for places that the government could easily acquire the property, either existing property or other property status that made it easy for the government to acquire the site. Another was location to transportation corridors. A number of these sites are next to railroad tracks. So from a practical standpoint, they wanted to have ways that the prisoners would be transported relatively quickly on, at that point in time, trains were the most predominant transport mode. So a number of the locations are near railroad tracks. One of the things I point out, again, the government in its whatever lack of coordination, the Santa Fe camp, you can see a number of positives for that rationale, but then one sticks out to me, and I'm sure others. Why is it, for such a security purpose, why did it turn out to end up only a few miles away from Los Alamos, which obviously had its purpose? And I think my answer there is two different parts of the federal government probably didn't talk to each other, but that's an irony to me, is that those two sites, are really were so close together.
There's another question about, was there any assistance provided to the dependents of the imprisoned? There's one example where you give 15 of whom were adults and 17 of whom were children, and they kind of follow we're all 32 imprisoned. Because it's interesting too, you did show a lot of pictures and most of them were males, but were some of the families imprisoned here?
Yeah, and again, I apologize for my answers being long, but the questions raise good points, and I want to try to provide a quick response. There's two parts to the answer. One is, and again, in a larger discussion, I would have time for this, but there was a redress movement done around associated with the incarceration experience. And the very brief points there is that the US government in the 1980s did start a study on the incarceration and to document that and then lead toward recommendations. There was a redress commission, and the couple of the recommendations were to formally provide an apology to all those that were affected, and then also to provide reparations, monetary reparations to those prisoners. That commission recommendation was adopted and passed by the US Congress, it was in the time frame that Ronald Reagan was president. He actually was the president who signed the bill that passed. And then after that, there was a formal apology letter sent to each of those living survivors of those camps, and a monetary amount as a reparation for $20,000. For a lot of cases, obviously that was not very much, but it was still both symbolic for the apology and for the US government acknowledging the mistake and then providing some monetary amount to the survivors. The other part of the question, just to have it encompassing, is that the men who were in the New Mexico camps generally, like you were noting, were there by themselves, but their families generally were then incarcerated and held in the WRA camps. So collectively, they may have been in different camps, but they were collectively in prison. And so any of the apologies or the reparations would have covered all of those prisoners, no matter what kind of a camp they were in. Yeah, so they did separate a lot of them then. Yeah, that follows up with one of the questions you kind of answered. One of the next questions we only have, they had asked about reparations, so it kind of went into that. So that's great. We have one more question here too. Have any attempts been made to move the eagle sculpture that was carved? She says it's shocking that it's so important and then being neglected, letting it deteriorate. I don't believe so. I know that was one of my first thoughts when I got started helping on this project many years ago, because it was a shame that they were there was no formal mechanism to protect. And so I don't have any positive news, and I don't know of any parties locally or statewide that are pursuing that. I can't provide anything more positive on that point.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have a few more questions, but maybe I'll talk to you some later about those too. As far as Fort Stanton, were some of the Japanese American prisoners held with the Germans that were there? Because I found it quite interesting that they used it, because there were a lot of Germans that were held there too from the luxury liner, which I thought was interesting because there's a museum space for that too. Is there a museum space for the Japanese Americans that were, or the Japanese who were held there?
Yeah, two parts to my response. As probably you all can appreciate, and your questions bring this out. There's lots of complexity and lots of depth to this chapter with the confinement project and experience going back to that time frame. And so it's good that those questions are being asked. And for those that are interested, like I said, there are the resources that you can check out to get more of that, or to follow up contact with me. The specific answer to what you were asking, yeah, that's one of the complexities. You're right that there was a large German prisoner camp at the site, and as you said, they were not military, but they were Germans who were on a ship, and I don't recall the story whether they ran aground or they were captured, but then they were then held at Fort Stanton for, I think, the duration of the war. And you're right, there was a specific section, actually just to the south of where the Japanese segregation camp was where that, and actually one of the images that I showed, if you looked above where I pointed to, you saw a whole bunch of buildings, and that was the that was the German prisoner area, very large on that side of the site. And again, most of those buildings have deteriorated. I've walked that area. There's a few of the buildings that remain, and someone who's knowledgeable can point out what they are, but most of them have collapsed or been removed from that area. There was, as I understand it, actually, when the Clovis people were brought to the Fort Stanton site, one of the residents, one of the teenage daughters, saw the German camp and knew about the German camps and said, "We don't want to be here because those are German prisoners, and who knows what's going to happen if we're mixed in with them." So that was one of the reasons, apparently, why the U.S. government officials said, "Okay, well, I guess we can't use Fort Stanton to hold the Clovis people," and so they drove a few miles to the Baca Camp. So again, there's a connection there, which is written in our book. But again, it's an illustration of many of the complexities in this chapter.
Well, I can put a link up to the book too, maybe, Victor, after this talk. If you want to send me that, I'll post that on that website, on our website page too, in addition to people having it on your side. So yeah, well, thank you so much. That was, oh yeah, okay, good.
Yeah. And as I touched on before, and thank you for mentioning that again, it is available, and then I'll share with you so you can post how people can get this. And then we will, for the upcoming events in Santa Fe, we'll make sure that these copies are available so that local residents who attend can pick it up in person if they want to.
Okay, and like I said, if anyone wants to email me too, I'll happily forward an email to Victor, but I'll put your email up on that website too after we're done here. All right, so thank you so much, Victor. Thanks for your patience in figuring out the technical issues. Really,
yeah. Well, the main purpose was to make it available for you all. So I'm glad we succeeded. And thanks again for the invitation. And everyone, stay safe and healthy through the pandemic.
And and we look forward to maybe seeing you talk again in person.
Exactly. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Have a good evening.